Okay, let me just get myself off of mute and take this moment to welcome everyone for joining us today. So as I understand, I'm not sure, do we have an audience from 2 time zones?
Yes,
so that's pretty awesome. That's quite exciting. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And yeah, I think we can basically get started. So today we're launching Dr. Warren and Gobani's book titled Anti-Racist Teaching Practices and Learning Strategies. And so let me just give you a brief sort of background about myself. My name is Ayanda Ndaba, and I'm a master's candidate at the University of Johannesburg, pursuing, or rather with an interest in renewable energy, looking at it from an anthropological perspective. And yeah, today is quite exciting for me as well, as I've recently started sort of getting into the education space as a tutor. And I thought it was quite powerful, the fact that this book came out now. And it just gave me a moment to sort of reflect on, the past year. As you might know that during lockdown, right at the beginning of COVID and with the heavier lockdown, we saw sort of the new rules really challenging, the South African schooling system in particular, and I'm sure even for the rest of the world in some instances. But I think in the South African context, it was quite acute seeing how, for the first time, or rather having to, how the way that COVID kind of made us reimagine schooling in a different way. And I think having, just had a glimpse of the reading and the book, I've come to appreciate how important it is for us to reimagine how we exist in an education space or in a classroom. I was particularly struck by one of the things that you guys speak about, which is that anti-racism in a classroom is really about meaning and how we construct meaning. And I thought that was quite a powerful, observation, because really, I take it for instance, as I said, I was making an example of the whole lockdown and how it challenged the schooling system. I live in a township, so obviously during the first couple of months of lockdown, school really started to lose quite a lot of meaning. All I could hear was kids in the street during that time. And it kind of also emphasized the differences in our society, where people with access to internet, for instance, were able to, still continue with school. Whereas if you didn't have internet or computer and all of that stuff, you were left behind. And I imagine that will have far-reaching consequences into the future as well. So without further ado, I'll actually ask Dr. Tovani, as well as Dr. Warren Chalklen, to engage us regarding the book. And the idea is to have the session quite conversational as well. And should you have any questions, of course, you're welcome to leave them in the chat, and then we'll address it from there. And we also have a lovely, panel who will also be discussing and responding to some of the points that have been raised by Dr. Tovani and Dr. Warren. So yeah, without further ado, thank you, Tovani. I'll just mute myself this side.
Okay, am I going first? Thank you so much. That was so wonderful, Ayanda, and you're really given so many talking points. And I think that certainly the COVID moment has shaken the education sector in so many different ways. And I think that's something that I think we don't discuss enough, the impact and the inequities that it's really revealed around education. So thank you so much for that. And I want to say I'm very proud that Ayanda is a former student. So it's not surprising to see you thinking at this level when you were trained by someone I won't mention names. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So thank you, everyone. So wonderful to see such a full room for this important launch. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. And like I said, it's especially meaningful because so many of the people on the panel, but also attendees, have been friends. They are former students, present students, mentors, and various other roles in my life. So it's really meaningful to see everyone here. My entry point into this book was really this idea of my own embodiment, right? And I center myself and I center my own background in coming from a rural context and coming from a low income background that was predominantly Black, but also culturally homogenous. So primarily amaXhosa. So for a long time, much of my life was really defined by people who shared the same racial background as me, shared the same ethnic group. It wasn't until I moved to university and I went to a predominantly white institution where I started to really encounter, literally within a few a few weeks of starting my university life, encounter issues around racism, white supremacy, racial capitalism, economic and structural violence, and so on, and many of these other instruments that are often used as instruments for dehumanization, particularly for Black persons. And so that background is really central to my entry point into this work because it's not something that is separate, but it is a part of my own embodiment and my own experiences. But I started teaching full time in 2015. As many people would know, that was a time of great change and resistance in the South African higher education sector, particularly through Fees Must Fall movement, Rhodes Must Fall, and outsourcing and various other student-led movements. And I just want to also say that I'm very aware that this wasn't the first time that these kinds of issues were had, but I think the kind of public conversation globally that it struck was very different to how it showed itself in the past. So I was really interested when I started to teach full time, because on the one hand, of course, I was a worker, but also at the same time as a postgraduate student dealing with many of these issues that the students were talking about, but also dealing with institutional structures that almost pretended, that were for business as usual. So when students are protesting, so Pumelele, Priscilla can share actually, because she was in one of those classes when, students are protesting, but the universities are pretending that, it's business as usual and that they are going to save the academic year. So I had a lot of these sort of tensions. On the one hand, of course, the need to make a livelihood, right? But also my solidarity with the issues that the students were raising. So my own background is quite central in how I teach and how I educate. My coming from a low income background, my racial background, and so on. But I'm also in a discipline, right, that some scholars have called that it's at the nexus of colonialism and knowledge production, that's anthropology. And so because also of the discipline that I'm located in, I've had to really confront issues around the coloniality of knowledge production, and the ways in which often anthropology specifically was central to the colonial project, right? So as a Black scholar and as an educator, I spend a lot of time thinking, particularly about anthropology, is can we actually ever use this discipline for decolonial purposes? And a key central aspect of decolonialism for me is really rethinking epistemology and really bringing in a multiplicity of voices. So really my contribution to the book is really around, you see a lot of it, it's a conversation with me, with Warren, with students, with literature, and it's really around thinking, how do we create anti-racist knowledge that is not used in the maintenance of systems of control, but knowledge that really centers care and humility in education. And I like something that Dr. Ntabiseng Motseme says, which is really that, decolonization is the struggle against alienation, right? And she was drawing from Fanon. And it's really this idea that people should not feel alone in the education sector because of your race, because of your gender, because of your sexual identity, because of your class background, and so on. A humane education is not one that alienates you, it's one that cares, it's one that has humility, and is ultimately imperialism and apartheid in the ways in which we educate. So I will stop there. I just wanted to just share that as my own entry point into how I was thinking about this book and what I hoped it would contribute. So thank you.
Wonderful. I will say that we promise to open it up for questions. I see there's a hand raised already. This is fantastic. Oh, Caroline, don't worry. Intentional or unintentional hand raising is perfectly acceptable. Everybody, this conversation today is actually very special for a different reason. I'd like to, before I even get started, to honor a very close mentor of mine. I also want to honor my mother and my father who are on this call, and anyone, and another Dr. Mentor from Columbia University, started in Cape Town, landed it up teaching at Columbia, and has been part of this work. I want to thank them as well. But I want to take a moment to just honor Mr. Becky Zungu, who I've just promoted to a panelist for a second. Mr. Zungu, if you are comfortable turning on your camera, this would be a great moment for you if you don't mind. And if you do mind, that's perfectly okay. I would like to just honor Becky Zungu, who mentored me at Wits University. Thank you very much. There we go. Mr. Zungu, I just want to take this time with everybody on this call to honor you and to thank you for mentoring me, making me into the teacher that I am today. And this work is a culmination of all of that. So just a huge thank you to you, and just a gratitude, a lot of gratitude to you. I think you're calling in from Wits today. So I see the work, the struggle continues. So thank you very much. And we just want to say thank you to you and appreciate you very much. Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Zungu. I will be very brief. I promise everyone. I have a habit of talking a lot, but today I actually want to take a different approach. And I'm a teacher by profession, and what that means is that I began my career in South Africa. And what that means is that my context and my curriculum was inherently embedded with various forms of injustice. And in many ways, my teaching, I taught to become a teacher to perpetuate this reality that we find ourselves in, which is inherently unjust. In other words, I was taught to not dismantle and criticize the reality that we find ourselves in, but rather I was taught to reproduce the reality, okay? And so I want to give us an example, and then I'm going to go straight into the conversation. I hope to do more listening than talking today. But I remember being a teacher in the classroom and thinking that if I changed the readings to include various voices, for example, we did the work by Makwasazana Xaba, a beautiful poem called Hair. And I looked at my syllabus and I looked at my curriculum and I said, well, we have scholars from all over the world in my curriculum. I'm teaching through an anti-racist lens. I'm teaching through a decolonized lens. I have arrived, okay? And I found in my discourse with many teachers, in my conversations with them, that was our conception of diversity, equity, and inclusion. If we change the curriculum, everything else will follow. But what I found was that in teaching the poem, all the learners had a pencil or a pen, and they would underline the tone and the register as I'm standing at the front of the classroom and telling them how to interpret the poem. Okay, telling them how, setting up the classroom so that it's me at the front and them at the desks, assessing them. Oh, your own interpretation of the poem is not what I taught, so I'm sorry, -5. Okay. And so as we began to think about that, yes, the knowledge may have been slightly, right, not even fully, slightly challenged. The dominance of white poets, for example, was challenged. But the lesson preparation, the classroom management, the teaching strategies and assessment were all part of the dominant model of oppression. And so as we begin to think about that, we begin to realize that South Africa, and in fact the world, I'm calling in from Dallas, Texas right now. In fact, our education system is designed to reproduce the society, to reproduce labor, to reproduce racial injustice, sexual injustice. And so the question we asked ourselves, Tobani and I asked ourselves is, would a system provide resources to teachers that will actually dismantle it because it has an interest in the current status quo? And so we thought about, although we are embedded in the system, please don't misunderstand me. We are embedded in the system, but Kobani and I came together to say, what would it look like to reimagine or provide a resource that helps and equips and challenges and lives in the tensions of dismantling the education system and reimagining it and rebuilding it. And this is by no means a recipe book or a tool book or anything like that. It's a workbook, which means you have to do the work. So I'm going to pause there and say one more thing that is very important. We distinguished between anti-racist teaching and decolonized teaching. And our goal is not to reproduce racism by just being anti-racist, but our goal is to also imagine what the education could look like in a socially just society, and to build the society through the education, through a new way of seeing the education system. So if nothing else, that was our goal. So I'm going to pause there and just say thank you to everybody who has given their time this morning. We hope it's going to be a valuable discussion, and we promise that everyone will have time to ask questions and engage with us. Thank you for being here. We are very honored and grateful to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just wondering if there's anyone in the discussion panel who's ready to respond to any of the comments that were made by Tobani and Warren.
Molweni, good afternoon. Warren, you have to forgive me. I have to do this because of my friend, because of my brother. I have to say, Kula kwetini ka baba kausen. Kula kwetini ah! Now that I've done that, Warren, let me change this because I'm using two screens. I will have to speak to why we are here today and my journey with Ukambela. I'm lucky enough to call him a friend. I'm lucky enough to call him a friend. I met Ukambela when I was doing my honors. And at that point, he was lecturing. It's such a pity. It's such a pity. You know, things like this must be done in person. You know, this deserved a full-on in-person view. I will be more conversational, more than anything, because I want to tell of the story that is us, and the story that speaks, I believe, to the title of this book, which is Anti-Racist Teaching Practices and Learning Strategies, and how this actual title paved the way for me to as an emerging young researcher in South Africa, in a sector that is highly dominated by men, to have a level of confidence and ease in self, in how I present myself, and in how I construct an argument unapologetically. So that whole, what I've just said, then demands me to tell of the story that is us, Gambela. So I meet Ukambela, this tall man with a gap. And I'm like, oh, Yehovah, I do not know what this is going to turn out to be, because I had just come out of Fees Must Fall as a student activist in a university that on a lot of levels used quite repressive and silencing mechanisms that were, for me, really speaks to the microaggressions of whiteness. Because whiteness operates on different levels, right? It tends to suffocate in silence. So you would see one by one, people are dropping off, people are dropping off, people are dropping off. And that had an impact, because that meant the majority of 2016, I did not spend in the classroom. The majority of 2015, I did not spend in the classroom because I was dealing with issues pertaining to Fees Must Fall. So coming into the honors, you are already a student who comes from a background of quintile 1 to 3 schools. Those with the South African context will understand what quintile 1 to 3 schools are in South Africa. You come into this space also with a socio-economic deficit in relation to your peers. You also come into this space with a sense of existential crisis in terms of who are you in relation to this space. I remember there was a course where an Australian woman came to present, and then she said in this presentation that we need to go into the wider community of Grahamstown, especially the township, so that we can learn and come out of our bubble. That is the purple bubble. That is what Rhodes University used to call it at that point. For me, there was nothing to learn from Joza, because I am a product of a community that is similar to Joza. So when you are sending me to go and learn from the community that has birthed me, that means your gaze is already problematic. That means how you view me in my relationality of belonging in this space is already problematic. That means I am viewed as a guest and not as a person who is meant to be here as per my academic ability. So those are the various levels I was operating under, coming into that third year honors. Another complexity layer that I came into this space carrying is the fact that, I will be honest, before honors, masters, and now the PhD journey, I have always been a mediocre student, guys. I was there in the 50s, right? So it was also a matter of, why don't you just drop out and go work? Because also the home environment in terms of my socio-economic upbringing was demanding that I go and work. So I meet Ukambela, and I'm very much insecure. I am very much insecure in me constructing a sentence. I'm very much insecure in my intellectual ability. I'm very much insecure in my belonging in the space. And what happened was absolutely magical and amazing. And it is that paving that enabled me to have what Professor Msindo, who's now the Dean of Humanities here at Rhodes University, we call him Ufather, always says, Ubana, you must have staying power. you must have staying power. And that is what Ukambela gave me in terms of, he saw me. He read my work. He saw beyond the incongruencies. He was reading in the voice I was writing. That's important. He read in the voice I was writing. And because he read in the voice that I was writing, he was then able to walk with me so that in this space that demanded a particular narrative of what is considered good academic, good writing, good relationality in terms of the different concepts and modes. That for me made me gain the confidence. But Chin, no man, I can. Chin, no man, this is possible. And every step of the way, when I say Ukambela walked this journey with me, every step of the way, it was affirmed constantly. Constantly, it was affirmed. And you know, that is sometimes when people say teaching, and program director, you will let me know about the time so that I don't go on for days. When they say teaching is a calling, right? You don't just go into a lecture room, you present, after presenting, you leave. Because it is not about your strongest students. It is about your struggling students. That is the core objective. When we say, even in the political structures of student movement, when we say no student is left behind, we are not talking about those who've got me. We are talking about those who are not seen by the system. Then that element of no student is left behind becomes important. So for him, and I will speak about you in the third, for him, it is a calling. It is a calling. Now, if I can just change into the academic, I say Kambela's work and how he uses the classroom is transgressive, it's transdisciplinary, it is transformative. It encourages cognitive and emotional perspective shifts that have the potential to shift socio-political ecologies of change. And I'm a product of that. Moreover, explicitly, it challenges normalized practices, cultures and systems that have become oppressive. You see, with teaching, especially in the former white institutions, and I haven't heard anybody who speaks about this. There's the arrogance of white mediocrity. It is the arrogance of white mediocrity. A person is arrogant on the premise of mediocrity. You see, because as Black students, we first need to deal with the language barrier. Number one, coming into the classroom, I must deal with the fact that I have to deal with who is not there, and who together, although but is, right? That's the first challenge. Number two, I have to compete with students who are comfortable in the language, who are not necessarily the brightest spark in the room, but because they've got the command of the language, they are in their mediocrity able to dominate space. Number three, you have the issue of the many conflicting issues of Black text, right? That then abstract Black students out of the system because of the many responsibilities that are there. And for me, had I not had a strong supportive structure of Black academics in the space who speak about the importance of staying power in academy, I would have long left. So when they say, program director, you will keep the time. When they say, uba inyathi ibuzwa kwabaphambili, it is also very important to see representation in the people who are rolling out the curriculum. Because that is where you then gain, I can do this. If Ukambela can do this, why can't I? So as I conclude, man, we need to, when Ukambela, I think you and Warren can speak to this. There are many students, there are many Black students, bright students who are coming into the system. In recent times, it's improving because we've got various support structures and systems. But I think we need to speak about the retainment of Black students from honors to masters to PhD. Access without retainment is nothing. It means nothing. Those are, what is that thing? It's called that Rainbow Nation. We see now the Rainbow Nation is very much fragmenting and coming to an end. So we cannot say the doors of education are open. When we look at the fine terms and conditions, those TTTs, we need to work on the strong retainment so that when we are speaking about transformation, it is transformed right from the top to the bottom. And it speaks to the antithesis of this book. Your mind, it speaks to the title of this book, that we perpetuate anti-teaching practices and learning strategies right through. Kambela, this is you always say this is a love fest. You always say, Uba, you must give people flowers. People must smell the flowers while they're still alive. Something like that. You always post it, but it's there. It's there. The quote is there. And diabulela kakhulu ngokwenzileyo. You are one of those I will one day write about. It is a pleasure to know you, and it's an honor to see you continuing the work that you do, AUJ. Warren, thank you. Thank you for walking this journey with us and being in solidarity with us. Aluta continua, Amandla.
Of course.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Luanda. That was, your response was so powerful. And I think a lot of Black students or, who've actually gone through these institutions can attest to the words that you've spoken today. And to those who know Gobani Kandela personally, they can testify to the words that you've shared with us. I'm not sure if Gobani would like to respond to Uluanda. But I think it would be interesting just to hear how, also I think from a personal perspective as well, how you've also walked that journey for me. I remember actually leaving in third year and feeling that seeing you there really encouraged me to pursue all the way to honors, and now I'm in masters. So I think a lot of people can attest to the work that you've done in that sense. So if you had any words that would, a response to Lwanda.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ayanda and Lwanda. And I had said in true disruptive education, because I was explicit. I was like, Lwanda, this is not a love festival today. I will have another ceremony where I can get the flowers. So trust you to not obey me. One of the things as you were talking about, I remember one of Rwanda's favorite songs, which is, Sizabala Zelili Zilokoko Betu Elili Zilavatavapya Sabala Eli. I thought about that, and I think that's what the work is about. Warren and I have a lot of conversations around this field of trauma-informed care, right, in education. How do we teach? I mean, if our students are coming into our classrooms already having experienced so much, forget the gender-based violence and so on, but also issues of economic and structural exclusion, how do we in the classroom not perpetuate these curriculums of violence, right? And that's exactly what Rwanda was saying, which is, how do you think consciously about these things? Maybe the teacher was well-meaning, in wanting to take students to the township, but also what does that do to, like as Rwanda was saying, to people who are the embodiment, right, of what is being taught. So I think a lot, certainly with Warren, we think a lot about how do we teach in ways that don't re-traumatize in education, but ways that Warren talks a lot about, this resisting sort of deficit narratives, right? Not just because Rwanda put a comma somewhere wrong, that it means she was very humble, by the way. She got a distinction, so she didn't, so she's not mediocre at all. But I mean, that was so heartwarming. And I think you've given us so much to reflect about. And certainly many of these topics, as you know, we talk about it, the suffocation of whiteness, issues of, socio-economic deficits in education, the existential crises, right, that our students come with into the classroom. And so I think it's so heartwarming to also see, and I know through your own work, Lwanda as well, which I was hoping you would share a bit more about, but that you are also engaging this issue, even though you're not in the classroom, but through your work in agriculture, you are teaching in many different forms. And I think that's what the best kind of teacher is to give you the instruments so that you can take it further, right? Because not every student comes in wanting to become an anthropologist, but how do you use anthropology in education? How do you use anthropology in agriculture and so on? So that was so meaningful. I don't know if Warren, you have a reflection?
Yes, one thing I found interesting, Luan, is you said, "I'm sorry, Warren, I'm about to." In that moment, there was almost, can I please ask for permission to disrupt? And what this book is saying is, we don't need permission. We must disrupt as a natural part of our being. And that energy, that affirmation, and of course it's different for all of us, but that love, this process of transformation is not only about creating justice in the future, it's about creating justice now. It's about finding ways to replenish our spirits, replenish our bodies, replenish our souls, because the educational process and society is designed to take and utilize. When we think of the word profit, profit is the exploitation of not only labor. When they say words like human capital, what we're talking about is taking from people, not only physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually, for the benefit of someone else. Okay. And so we have to then find ways through our processes, through the ways in which we relate to one another, to mutually share and replenish the spirits of one another. So Luanda, You have shared this, your voice has catapulted around the world. I think we have 6 or 7 countries. And if you're in the evening right now or early morning, good morning. I hope you're having a cup of coffee, but your voice has catapulted and replenished the spirits of many on this call. And I'm hoping we can keep that spirit going. So Nkosi, Sibongile.
Thank you for that reflection. Perhaps we could have one of the other panelists.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, perfectly loud and clearly, magnificent.
Wonderful, wonderful.
It's magnificent, Nkosi, a third year communication and anthropology student. I'm also a tutor at the University of Johannesburg. There's a lot I can say about it. Thank you for giving this opportunity on this platform. It really is an honor and a privilege as an undergrad. And I think I'm the only undergrad, if I'm not mistaken, on the list. And it's a huge privilege to be here. I mean, for real. And there's a lot I can say about myself and Mr. Ngoban, how he has helped me to be where I am today. And how he has contributed in my life as a tutor and as a human being. And on the book that I'm writing called Life Without a Coach, which is a motivation book that will help a lot of students, a lot of people out there to be motivated to go big in life, because life is a film. It's about you as a character and what do you play as an individual. It's about the narrative that you carry to the next film that you're going to write. Because as I'm sitting here, I'm writing a film to someone else. Someone else might use the same thing that I'm saying today to help another student or another person who's in the same situation that I am. I remember when I first, in my second year, when I text Mr. Ngobane with an assignment of mine, it was the 5th of May, 2020. And I was so stressed. And as a lecturer, and we're on this online platform, learning on that platform is very difficult for a student, but he then made education for us to be easy. And I was reading the book under 2 concepts. And let me just say, Mr. Warren, Dr. Warren, why do you see Mr. because you're a doctor now? Dr. Warren and Dr. Ngobane, your book is very insightful. It will help a lot of people. When you start reading the concept of content and preparing a lesson, as a tutor, that's what fascinated me a lot about going in class, knowing that I have to prepare and I have to know the content. And that's what Mr. Ngobane has installed in us. He prepared for us, Gucci, whenever you go to class, you need to know, he understood the content of what he's going to teach to his students or to whatever student that is going to come across. He understood the lesson that is going to teach. He made anthropological theory seem easy, even though it was difficult to us, but he made sure that the lesson that is teaching to us, it is easy. So that's the responsibility of a teacher, to not facilitate basically, but to educate, to teach, to transform the society to be a better place. And then I also want to quote Luanda's word when he said, when I submitted the essay to him on I think it was the 7th or the 8th, I got a distinction thanks to him. He read that particular assignment in my voice, in my words. He wrote what I was writing in my voice. He understood my position as a researcher. He understood my position as a writer. He understood where I was coming from with my research, because when an educator, when a teacher understood what you're writing, than putting his mentality, than being, I'm sorry to say this, but when a teacher is becoming racist to a particular concept or putting himself in that particular position of saying, no, this is what I believe in, which is kind of wrong in the system that we live in. But we need teachers who will facilitate, teachers who will understand the concept, detaching themselves from whatever is happening in the surrounding and understanding a concept in a much wider spectrum, which is helping a lot of students out there. So in terms of understanding the content knowledge, we need to get the Ngobane's show. I call him Dr. GQ, I don't call him Ngobane, because I feel like for me it is too much to call him Dr. Ngobane Ngampela. It is too much. So I call him Dr. GQ because he's a legend to me. He's a mentor. He's a father. He's a father figure. And in my book, that one that I'm writing, I've quoted one of his words when I met him. I think this year, he said, let's not go to school because we have to. There must be a vision behind it. There must be a mission. You must have certain goals to achieve when you go to school. So I'd like Ngobane to just take this moment and appreciate everything that you've done for my life and everything that you've done for a lot of students. I know you've come a long way. I know you're going far. And There are a lot I can say about you, and I feel like as I'm going to do my honors next year, as I'm going to the film industry next year to make a lot of movies, and as I'm going to do whatever I'm doing, I hope what I'm doing, it'll inspire you and inspire a lot of people out there. And I hope I didn't miss something about you, because there's a lot to say about you. Just you're just a human being. Like, you're something else in this world. You deserve your own country where people could come and just watch you on your own and say, shake your hand, hug you, and just leave, because you're one in a million. You're one in a million. And I appreciate knowing you. I appreciate you being my lecturer in second year. I hope you can lecture a lot of people. You still the mentality that you've installed to me, and I'm really grateful. Dr. Warren, please make sure that you take care of him. More writing to you guys, more work, and I wish him nothing but the best. And then yeah, it's an honor to know him, and it's an honor to finally meet you, Dr. Warren, because I was worried looking at your picture and saying, hey, there's a guy called Dr. Warren. Hey, people are more life. So so I'm really happy. I'm really happy. And as for the topic, I researched about the topic because I was kind of lost in the process. Which when they say Achirestis, teaching and practices, learning and strategies, what exactly is the book about? Because when you're reading a book, and I was reading this book by Marcos Onataba, The Alkalinity of Bottled Water. It's a nice book about poems. And thanks to Dr. Ngobane for this book. I really appreciate it. When it says anti-racist education, I was like, okay, but they're starting now. We're going far, anti-racist education. But then when I was sitting down reflecting on it, basically you guys meant that it refers to multicultural education. We don't come with the same method of teaching, but we need to be more strategic. We need to be more abroad. We need to educate people in anti-discrimination mode, where we challenge the discrimination that is written, because a lot of theories that have been written are under the discrimination methods, and they try to challenge a certain phenomenon. But it's you as a teacher to detach yourself from that particular system and educate them or teach them in a certain way that will appeal to a student. And also that you guys also reflected to teachers coming to class ill-prepared, are not prepared enough to teach a particular concept. And I love that Ngobane was never ill-prepared. He was never ill-prepared. He will make sure that he cracks joke, sense of humor, which is very important. He will make sure that, and that's funny, that's one of the funniest thing about him. He will not get his joke at the first time. But as you think about it, you'll see that, okay, he's a funny guy. He makes a lot of joke, and he makes sure that the student is comfortable in his lesson. And that's what I'm trying to do as a tutor going forward in my working place, to make sure that I apply the same phenomenon that he has taught me, because you learn from someone else. So in this world, we learn, or we apply things by learning from someone who's above you. So to So to me, thank you, Ngobane. Ngiyabonga.
Tamaku. I know So Magnificent sent me a message, and I know the chapter on curriculum preparation was one of the ones that resonated the most, and that's more Warren's specialty. So I'm going to, this is something Warren and I do. So whenever I get a difficult question or something to reflect on that's a little bit out of my expertise, I hand it over to him. So I'm going to let you take this one, Warren.
So Magnificent, Yazuguti, Ubuti Kobani, he has many strategies, teaching strategies. Yeah, well, one of those strategies is to give the thing to me. Yes, no, Nkosibuti. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is becoming a buzzword around the world. And when we break down equity, I just want to focus on this word equity, and let's unpack and unwind this word. Basically, equity is about fairness, but we need to ask ourselves, okay, if we're talking about fairness, then there must be unfairness. And if there's unfairness, then maybe there's injustice. And if there's injustice, what types of injustice do we have? And as we know, there's racialized injustice, there's capitalistic injustice, there's all forms of injustice, okay? And so when we talk about equity, what we're actually talking about is oppression. It's become a palatable, corporatized word, but underneath it, we are dealing with oppression. Now, when we talk about anti-racism, racism is one form of oppression. And so we need to be reflecting on, if racism is one form of oppression, how do we dismantle oppression? And the only way to dismantle oppression is to widen our gaze to think about decolonization, which is the various ways in which forms of oppression combine to impact the internal ways we think, our relationships, the interpersonal, internal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. So the ways we think, the ways we interact with one another, the institutions, and the ways in which those institutions overlap to form structures. So the tension that we face, Magnificent, that you raise in very different ways, is the tension that Kobani and I face together. You know, when you talked about Kobani cracking jokes and helping us learn, in very similar ways, this book tried to deal with the tension of two things. On the one hand, excellent teaching, which is anti-racist teaching, okay, which is anti-oppressive teaching, because we need our students, all students, to succeed. We cannot sit back and say, well, you know what, we'll wait until the system changes and then we will begin to teach. No, Black students, students of color, indigenous students, marginalized students must succeed so that we can dismantle. On the other hand, so we have this anti-racist teaching, but on the other hand, we have to fight to change the system itself, this decolonized perspective. We need to change the policies, the procedures. You know, we talk about firing people but we don't talk about firing institutions, dismantling them, closing them, and building different institutions. So we try to grapple with both of those things, because on the one hand, it's naive to say, you know what, we'll wait or we'll work to dismantle the system and we'll figure things out after that, okay? Or we'll just teach within the system through an anti-racist lens and wait for capitalism to capture and co-opt the language of anti-racism for its own ends. Already, companies like Lexus are producing advertisements telling you about diversity, equity, and inclusion while they're trying to sell you a car. The same companies that put out statements around Black Lives Matter are the same companies that are responsible for devaluing Black lives. So how can we expect these companies whose job is to exploit us in various ways to also value Black lives? It's impossible. And that's why we have to think through a decolonized lens so that we can unpack and decode what is actually going on, whilst at the same time pushing an anti-racist agenda as best as we can. So that tension is all throughout the book, and it's a difficult one and it's painful in various ways. So I just wanted to highlight that. That's something magnificent that you sparked in my head, and I'd love to also ask for some of our audience members to add to that. Ayanda, there might be some questions in the chat, just to let you know. But Magnificent, you'd love to respond to that. I'd love to hear your voice. What are your thoughts?
Just before he responds, can I also just share that he is also being very humble, but he's already started being the embodiment of these issues that he's raising. So his tutoring is a very successful tutor at UJ. Over 75% of his students get distinctions. So he is already, and I think just linking to what Warren was saying very quickly before I let you respond, Magnificent, is something that you said that really struck me, was that there are different ways to learn, right? And we have often a very rigid kind of approach in traditional education around the kinds of expectations we have. But when I think also of a student like you, although, you know, for instance, you have a passion for anthropology, but you also do so much. So one of the things we talk about in the book is that, of course, we recognize that we work in formalized institutional settings, right, that often have their own ideas around how we assess, but also I often think a lot about how do I engage a student like you who has so much to offer the world, right? Which is you teach through popular culture, you make films, you teach about rape culture through, you know, popular culture and so on. And I think we miss that when we follow a very rigid sort of narrow approach to how we educate, and we lose students like you who can teach in different forms. And Bell Hooks always says it all the time, that popular culture is where the pedagogy is, right? Most people in the world don't learn through textbooks. They learn through film, they learn through social media, and they learn through music. And so I think the work that you're already doing by yourself is already the embodiment of what Warren and I are trying to stress here, which is how do we capture the imaginations of our students in ways that don't say, what is this film that you made? What does it offer us? No, read this textbook. But how do we engage various forms in which young people learn? And I think you're such a perfect example of someone who's so comprehensive through your clothing line, through your movies, through your own writing, intellectual writing, right? Because you're also a very strong academic student. So I think you are such a joy, and I can't wait to see what you're gonna do in the world.
Guys, I'm still young. You make me feel like I'm already old. I'm still. You make me feel like I've accomplished a lot. Like I'm still on that process of doing the most, and I feel like already, I deserve my own check. Say, I see, you've done it. This is you. But thank you for the recognition. Thank you for just the word of praise. I didn't know that I'm doing so much in life until I read the part that was in the post. I know which I have a clothing brand. I know which I was doing. I'm writing a book, but I didn't know that I'm doing a lot of things. I didn't know that I'm changing lives in a lot of people. I didn't know that a lot of students are successful because, or some of them, they are doing well in their academics because I'm playing a certain role in their life. Because I've learned it from someone. You need to play a role in order for someone to also play a role in someone else's life. So it's like me giving you a book, you also give it to someone. So me feeding you some of the food that I've ate, so that you can also get some of the energy that I'm getting. So it's basically just generating certain nutrition to people, and then to reach a certain level of success. So I'm grateful for what I'm doing. So my idea on this whole thing, I also love the book that it does not specify on, it doesn't have color on it. Like a lot of people when they're looking at the book, they're looking at color, which okay, as you say anti-racist, are you talking about black or white? I just like it's a book that deals on black race, white on white race, whatever color it's talking about. I enjoyed reading it, and I will just encourage a lot of people to buy it. It's a very good book. It does not discriminate. It does not challenge anything. It just educates you on how to deal with certain things in life and how to be a good educator, and how to transform society to be a better place. As an anthropologist myself, can I claim that? As an anthropologist myself, I know a lot of how, like, I didn't know much about how to deal with society, but learning through a lot of things and reading this book has helped me a lot in terms of how to be a good tutor, and also how to come in class prepared, and also how to go in the field to shoot a film, or for me to write my book. No, because you can't just write a book, wake up in the morning, say I'm writing this chapter. You need to first find your position. What perspective are you writing up? Don't be subjective. Just try to write this book with an objective mind to say, I'm writing because I want to achieve 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it has helped me a lot. It has helped me a lot not to say I'm looking at, as I'm writing my book, to focus on Black people. I'm focusing on different cultures. I'm being anti-racist now in some kind of way. So I'm being multicultural, looking at motivating white people, Black people, colored, Indian, everybody, like everybody. So I'm grateful to be in part of the session and for the book. And I hope a lot will come from it.
Thank you so much, Magnificent, for that response. I think we also have I think it's on questions. It's more of a comment. It's from Lindy Swa, who is just reiterating some of the words that have been spoken already by Magnificent and Rwanda. Just to say and contextualize the difficulties for young academics in higher education institutions. I'm not sure if and this is more of a question for Warren and Tobani, and on how we go forward from here. We have reached the hour mark. As I understand, we've dedicated 2 hours. If perhaps we can go for a 5-minute stretch, if that's okay, or if you're happy to continue with the session. I don't know if there's any thoughts on that.
I think let's continue.
Okay, awesome. So I think we can invite some of the panelists as well. Let me just have a view here.
Ayanda,
I think Priscilla has. I think Priscilla hasn't responded as of yet.
Ayanda, I want to let you know that I figured out how to get people onto the panel to ask their questions live, and then we can take them off if that's an option for somebody. Just to let you know, my Zoom expertise has increased in the last 2 minutes, so we will give it a try. Just to let someone know if they raise their hand, we can bring them on.
Okay.
But I will let you call on who you would like to call on. So if someone has a question, please raise your hand. Thank you, Ayanda. Sorry.
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron. I see Priscilla has unmuted.
Yeah. Can I go? Can I ask a question? Okay. All right. Again, I was experiencing a lot of technical stuff, but it seems like everything is fine now. So for my contribution, I really I'm always critical of the idea of diversity and inclusion and intersectionality and all these other, buzzwords we constantly use, right? Because it's so easy for us to speak about these things that are obviously incredibly important. But at the same time, when it comes to the actual implementation of these things, it becomes incredibly difficult, right? How do you navigate that space as a lecturer who's lecturing about gender, right? And your own beliefs of gender and sexuality and the orientation of the body, how do they not interfere with the content that you are supposedly are meant to teach, right? So my questioning and my thinking is surrounding of who you are as an individual, right? Who you are as an individual. Because currently I work for an organization, it's a trans organization here in the Eastern Cape. And one of the things we do is working with stakeholders. This would be the Department of Health, Department of Justice, the Department of Home Affairs, SAPS. And when you sit there and you do the work of sensitization and you sensitize all these people that have a lot of power, right? These nurses, these police officers, etc. And you give them this information, and there's a moment of reflection there, right? They reflect at the end of the sessions and they're like, I just can't, I can't actually help LGBT people. I can't help LGBT patients because my belief does not allow me to do that. And so my thinking in bringing this particular experience into this conversation is thinking and wondering what's the kind of work that can possibly be done to create a classroom that is authentic in terms of transformation and the body that is responsible for transforming the space. I don't want to be very long, but maybe I can just add my personal experiences with all Dr. Kwambela. It's the first time I'm saying it live, Dr. Kwambela. Oh my gosh. So we met at Rhodes University. It was 2017, my second year. And he was teaching me anthropology my first year when I was doing different credits. And one of the things I had always experienced in Kwambela's classes, it is always motivation, it's inspiration, it is constantly pushing you to the edge as a thinker, as a potential researcher, and always trying to be critical as much as possible. And so I think one of the things I appreciated from his work and his style of lecturing was just being seen, just the feeling of being seen, and not a feeling of just being seen, but actually ubona, in fact, that you are in class, that you carry a particular experience that adds value in what we are talking about, right? That everyone has knowledge and everyone carries this knowledge, and this knowledge is very significant in how we learn together and how we progress in terms of our thinking, right? And I speak about being seen because for me, I carry a trans experience. I'm a transgender woman. And so a lot of the time when I navigated higher education, you know, I felt a lot of exclusion, and I experienced a lot of, you know, otherness, to constantly be othered, right? And otherness doesn't always happen in terms of actively, you know, creating spaces that are violent for your body, right? Sometimes being othered is just not speaking about trans content in anthropology. You know, sometimes being othered is not speaking about Janet Mock when you're speaking about, you know, Blackness and womanhood and feminism. You know, sometimes just add like leaving out queer content, trans content, that is very significant in how we shape our views and our ideas of what feminism is, or what it means to be a Black person. So for me, I think it's constantly being that, receiving rather the idea of being seen from Gambela. And I say this because a lot of the time, I mean, now I'm no longer in university. I'm working in organizations, and that's one of the things I learned from him. And one of the things you actively see is that the exclusion of Black transgender women in higher education is, it's not just something that happens, right? It is something that is definitely, you know, organized, and is something that is definitely, you know, a reflection of society, right? So the general idea of Black trans women is that they are born, they're assigned to male at birth, and then they grow up in this liminal space, you know, not sure if they are men or women. And this is the part where when you become visibly queer, and then after that, you experience discrimination at home, in your communities, and in other very social institutions, right? Which includes all the schooling system. So most of these ladies drop out of school, right? So then you experience homelessness, unemployment, and then the other way of making an income for yourself is the sex work industry, right? And then when you enter the sex work industry, you experience other violences and risks and discriminations that come with the sex work industry. And so when I was obviously at the time when I was at varsity, and I couldn't make sense of, you know, why is it that a lot of lecturers, you know, are not responsive to people's pronouns, you know, and actively don't care if they misgender them, etc. And for me now, I can sort of be like, it's actually a reflection of just society, that it actually comes into the space that is assumed to be such a progressive environment, and that advocates for, you know, people in society to think highly and to think, you know, just differently and interrogate the way they think and see the world, these research contributors. But going back, what I've really appreciated and I've loved about Dr. Gambela's class is the feeling of being seen, and how we discussed queer content, and how I was able to have moments where I was, you know, allowed to be vulnerable, you know, because there's times when you discuss content in class that you're not only carrying the knowledge of reading the book or reading the paper or the article, but you carry the knowledge of experience, you know, you carry experience. And so, yeah, thank you, Kobani. I always laugh and I feel okay, like, it's just a thing, but thank you so much. And I deeply love you. I love your work, and I cannot wait for so much more to happen. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. Gobani, do you want to respond?
Sure. I thought, you know, we have two very interesting chapters that I thought about both of them as I was listening to Priscilla. By the way, I love you more, as you know. And it's the first two chapters, right? And the first one is really the chapter around are we educating for liberation, or are we just, as Warren hinted at earlier, are we just wanting to reproduce, right, these curriculums of violence? And I thought also about the second chapter, which I think is so profound, if I do say so myself, which I think is so profound in thinking about self, right, relationships and school and the community, right? Because one of the things we really recognize is that we can't separate, right, the self from the other context in which the students also have to navigate. So I just thought it's such one of the other terms that we talk a lot about in the book, Warren and I, is this notion of rehumanization, right? How do we create classrooms that don't dehumanize, but really bring people, almost bringing someone back into their humanity, right? And so I know Priscilla and I and so many of the students who have had these conversations so many times, and I'm sure I don't always get it right? Often my content, my class lecture notes don't really include, for instance, the experiences of people with disabilities and so on. So it's always a process, right, of thinking about, and that's why I think we opened that chapter, chapter 2, with that vignette of a student who's, she shares that, of course, she wants an education, right, where she can get a job and so on. But this education is also includes considerations of her community and conversations of self and the various kinds of relationships. So for her, the education in that particular instance is not just, she's of course interested in learning about economic violence and structural violence, but there are also so many other things, which is number one, having experienced herself the worst of the South African public health system, the education for her is also a tool that she wants to use for justice, which is to get justice for her family, where, the South African government was responsible for basically half of her family being disabled, right, or living with a disability. So I think, and I think that's what Priscilla is really giving us. It's just like, I thought it was so profound that she started with, this notion of who are you as an individual, right? We have the concepts, right, intersectionality, anti-racism, but who also are you when you come into the classroom? And how do we also center these considerations of the knowledge of someone's experiences and so on? So I think I have more reflections than necessarily answers for Priscilla. But thank you so much. That was such a gift, Warren.
Priscilla, I want to just express gratitude to you, and I'm just loving the love on this call. I hope the audience is also experiencing love. There is love on this call. We just want to thank you for that. One of the reflections that I think about is the silences. There are silences that speak louder. Something Luanda also mentioned, the omission is louder than the presence in many ways. And something I was thinking about, and something that Kobani talks about, is the violence of silence, the process of schooling and education. Schooling is this process, this violent process of silencing the voice, the character, the essence of the human being, and essentially objectifying the person in order for them to take their place in society. And I use that in air quotes. And what I was thinking through, when Priscilla asked the question, what work can be done for transforming a space so that people can be their authentic selves? One of the questions that I think about so often is the importance of language in this conversation, the importance of how we think about the world. And if I might offer an example, I attended a class in which this very world-renowned professor spoke about racism from this perspective of economic inequality. Okay. And his basically the premise of what his class was all about was that if we address economic inequality, we can address racism. Okay. Now, the question I had to ask myself was, how do you define economic inequality? And as one can imagine, it was defined from the patriarchal perspective of money. If we distribute wealth, then we will solve the problem of racism and we can move on. Okay, and this is a prominent scholar in this field. The question I have to ask myself is, why are we limiting this conception of the economy to money and not to the various ways in which the system has created currencies of oppression? So when we think about, for example, this term economic inequality, we have to think about the ways in which race is a currency. It has been assigned value by the system. Okay, we have to think about the ways in which gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, sexual identity, gender expression are assigned values by the system in which there is an economy of racial oppression, there's an economy of gender, sexual oppression, and these various other forms. And so when we talk about things like black tax, that helps us, that language helps us begin to decipher the social, political, and economic ways in which the so-called economic inequality, it increases the dimensions of the ways in which we think about things. And so Priscilla, your question, what can be done? I think the question for me is always, how can we expand the dimensions of the ways we think about these things? And one of the ways in which I'm always challenged, and Kobani challenges me, and I feel like Kobani's student in many ways, because we are challenged by the language we use. How can we shift our language and shift our practice? And so I think for me, that's one of the challenges as someone in education, is to really, if we're going to name something, to really unpack it and define it from multiple dimensions and really try and embed it as best as we can in the lived experiences of all of us. The second thing I'm going to say really quickly is decentering the authority of the teacher. As a white person in this space, I am in many ways disrupting and in very oppressive ways. I'm a white male in this space, and there's an acknowledgement of that, okay? And what this book tries to do is tries to decenter the whiteness, decenter the authority of the teacher, and really center the lived experiences of the learner as best as it can. And only in that relationship where the teacher and the learner are students, are learning from each other, can we begin to think about this in a more deeper way? So the question, it doesn't have an answer, but I'm just kind of reacting to this multidimensionality of it and the decentering nature of this. And so I just wanted to kind of add that to the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Warren. I think we have a question on the chat. It's from Dan van Rooyen. And it reads, I'd love to hear where you two are finding your hope and grounding in this work.
Sure, but I also think there was supposed to be, I don't know if, is Lesejo in the room? Lesejo, are you? Yeah. Okay, I don't know if Lesejo is around, but it's okay, because he was on the poster. But I think for me, my hope comes actually from students themselves. My friends can tell you I had a bit of a tough early week this week, and I was so a little bit despondent. And then I think 2 days ago, I had student consultations the whole afternoon, and I kept saying to my friends, I went in so demotivated, so sad, and feeling despondent a little bit about the world and dealing with my own little existential crisis because of this particular incident that doesn't even matter anymore. But I left feeling so, from all of those students, just first of all seeing the hope, because in South Africa still, I guess education, even with all the issues we know around graduate unemployment and so on, but there's still a lot of hope that students carry, right, about what these degrees or this education is going to mean in terms of their future life circumstances. And it was just like this, where from 12 o'clock till probably like we went into the evening, where we were all just talking, and it wasn't just a supervision meeting. We were talking about life and where we are at the moment and so on. So I think students, I particularly in the education sector, ground me. But also I have really amazing mentors. Professor Joy Owen, who I'm not sure if she's here, but I had hoped she would, has been an amazing mentor in terms of embodying a humane education system. I have friends who are around my age, many of whom are here. I saw Lindy Swa. We've, gone all the way from undergrad, and now we are all educators and just sharing those experiences. So I find my hope there. I have to say, in terms of the sort of structural, the more structural aspects of it, I tend to be quite demotivated or a little despondent about sometimes the people who quote unquote leaders in higher education, but students, friends, mentors are my biggest source of hope whenever I feel discouraged. And someone like, I remember last year at the peak of when we had quote unquote level 5 in South Africa, which was the hard lockdown. And I just remember Magnificent's class and how it gave me so much hope every day to ironically teach in a time where it felt like the world was ending. So and I really pray with everything in me that the relationship that I have and what the students give me and hopefully what I give them can continue perpetually for as long as I'm alive. But that's my biggest source of hope. So thank you for that question, Dan.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I really encourage people to give us questions. We have to get Ayanda to start engaging us deeply. Come on, Ayanda. We appreciate you so much, Ayanda. So thank you so much. Dan, this question is so critical. I will say that I'm smiling and I'm happy here on the screen, but many people can attest that, mental health is something that I struggle with. It is something that once you see, you cannot unsee. And the weight is different in different ways. And so not only on myself, but my family and various people that are very close to me, we are experiencing joy and solidarity in this call, but we have to recognize the reality of the edifice of oppression that confronts us in various ways. And being a white person, I have to also reflect on the ways in which the structure doesn't operate against me in the same way. So I always have to acknowledge and be humbled by that. Nevertheless, something that has fundamentally shifted my thought process around this is this idea of being in process. This idea that this is not something that has an end goal. This is reimagining and building the world doesn't start in the future, it actually starts now. And thinking through the locus of control and thinking through the ways in which Audre Lorde talks about taking care of oneself, I'm paraphrasing, but taking care of oneself is sometimes the ultimate act of resistance. And so finding the spaces of resistance, finding opportunities to disrupt, but also finding opportunities to just replenish amongst love and compassion. And for example, throughout this work, Kobani and I can say there were moments in which this was very difficult. There were moments in which this was painful. This process is painful, but we can either experience pain from other things, or we can sometimes choose the pain that we go through, and sometimes having a purpose for the pain makes it a little bit more bearable. So I will say that fundamentally my grounding is a commitment to being in process with and not for others, with others, building those relationships, those friendships, those brotherhoods, those sisterhoods, those trans relationships, those transcendence. All of those pieces are what make this work meaningful in various ways. So I don't have too much more to say on that. It's more complex in my spirit and my heart. I don't have the language to explain it any further than that. But thank you for the great question, Dan.
Yeah, just a quick note on that. I mean, we write quite a little bit, well, quite extensively actually in the workbook about the importance of feeling, right? And I was talking to a friend again earlier in the week, and we were talking about, you know, the need to actually feel. And I wanted to just read something from the book from Kanita Mohammed, who I consider a mentor, along with Danai Mubotsa, and because they've written a lot about, you know, the need to actually feel. And this is what we wrote, that, you know, when she was giving the keynote at the African Feminism Conference in September 2019, at the University of Anthropologist and novelist Kanita Mohammed shared about the importance of feeling. She shared that, you know, if we can, we need to feel it all. And she said that in a world that demands we're numb to violence, that we're numb to pain, the hard stuff matters. It is where empathy lies. It is where compassion lands. Numbness does not save us. And that always changed. That changed completely how I feel. Even when I'm feeling a little bit sad, or I'm feeling, you know, I want to leave the academy. I never want to, you know, deal with institutions of learning. I always allow myself the opportunity to feel whatever that is, because as Kanita argues that, you know, we know from studies of, for instance, particularly violent masculinities, that most of the violence we experience in society is linked in some ways to limited registers of people not refusing to feel, refusing to empathize, refusing to, so however hard it is. And I had to literally force feed myself this week, because I was feeling, like I said, a little bit despondent. So I do think part of it is of course this beauty that education does give us, this interaction with the student, but also a lot of the times we have to feel ourselves through sometimes very painful forms of dehumanization, whether it's from, you know, seniors in these institutions, or you know, but I think feeling myself through a goodness, but also sometimes the more challenging aspects has been so healing, quote. I don't like that word, but yeah, forms of healings. But anyways, yeah, Ayanda.
All right, thank you so much. Actually, I have a question of my own while we wait on more questions from the audience. And my question is sort of something that Priscilla had touched on, which is she mentioned sort of this resistance of sorts. I think she was speaking about going to police stations and you know, speaking to nurses and having this somewhat resistance to this feeling, or to the compassion that you mentioned. I'm just wondering how you and Warren sort of, and I guess also it speaks to who your expected audience would be or is regarding this book. And of course, you know, the question really derives from the fact that South Africa in particular, if you look at these, you know, for instance, township schools or schools where, you know, you don't have the best resources and you probably have 60 students. And I imagine now it's basically because of the pandemic, one of the things that the pandemic has actually solved, which was this overburdening on teachers. But I guess the question that I'm trying to fundamentally get at is, with all of the challenges that educators, particularly in the public sector, how do we mitigate, or how do we engage those particular teachers to embody the kind of work that you write about in this workbook?
Kobani, if it's okay, I'm feeling compelled. Please allow me to step back when, please.
No. This part is definitely for you.
One of the key parts of this question is, who is the audience? And what can they expect? And I think one of the key things that Kobani and I were thinking about is that this is not just for South African teachers. This is not just for teachers based in the US. This is a global conversation, because frankly, colonialism is a global concept. But how does someone experience colonialism? They experience it when they walk into an institution of whatever kind and experience a lack of empathy, experience a dehumanized experience. That is where the quote unquote rubber of oppression hits the road. So the question is, how do we begin to tackle that? One of the things that I think this work is so important is to understand that many people will use religion as a way of justifying oppression. And what we try and do in this book as a subtext is to not talk about religion as belief, but talk about religion as power. And that's a word that we haven't really spoken about as much. In Afghanistan, when Malala was shot for going to school and they justified it using the Quran, the Taliban used the Quran to justify that, she stood up and she said, that's not about the Quran, it's about your power to determine whether I go to school or not. Okay. And so in various contexts, when we think about the US context where you have on slave plantations, there were churches built on those plantations to justify the system of slavery. That is not about religion as belief, that is about religion as power. Okay. And so one of the key audiences that we need to really, really reflect on is to really understand the justifications people use for a lack of empathy, for a lack of humanity towards other people, and question the power and the justifications that they are then using. And so what this book tries to do is to help us decode people's justifications for dehumanizing other people. And because of that ambitious goal, okay, it's an ambitious goal, but because of that ambitious goal, anybody can be the audience because all of us participate in other people's oppression. Now, again, it's teaching practices and learning strategies. So there is a natural audience, okay? I'm not trying to say it's anybody can pick up this book. There's a natural audience for those who are involved in educational spaces. But again, we have to widen our conception of education because it limits us in many ways, this idea of schooling as an institution and education as liberation. Okay, and so anywhere where there are people, anywhere where there is power, there is education happening there. There's a pedagogy that is occurring there. And our vision, our ambition, the thing that fueled our fire was to, wherever there is people, wherever there is power, for people to be equipped to identify it and work to dismantle it. That's ambitious, and it doesn't always occur. And so the experiences that Priscilla have mentioned are real experiences. And so our goal here was to begin to talk back to the police officer, to talk back to the medical professional, to talk back to their justifications for oppression in ways that actually highlight their own internalized forms of power as best as we could. Gobani, I'm gonna pause and hand it over to you.
Sure. I just want to read a paragraph that I think just so beautifully sort of continues from what Warren, and I think for sure, I think there is no doubt, of course, that, probably students or people working in formalized education settings would be in many ways the most attracted to a book like this. But I think the kinds of conversations we wanted to have, as Warren was saying, go so broader than just the classroom, right? And I think this paragraph really sums it up, because we write that decolonization in our context, or the context of the book, really celebrates, works by the likes of Tabitha Motseme, who really defined decolonization as new ways of doing, new ways of seeing, new ways of relating, right? And that decolonized teaching negates notions of equality and instead centers equity. So issues around fairness, issues around justice, both in both material and non-material reparations, and liberation, right? How do we live fully with others? So it's really not about only what we have, it's not only about what we're against, actually, what we argue, but that also what we are for, right? Which is issues of equity, justice, and liberation. And those issues go beyond the classroom. And I think, of course, we want students to read the work and to engage it. We want educators working in both formal and informal settings. But I think we also invited the kind of panel we did, because we wanted people like Priscilla who work in, NGO sectors. How do we think about also using the workbook to engage issues of equity, issues of trans rights, right? And that's why we wanted a diverse panel. So I think, of course, we want educators to get it, but I think what we had hoped for, as Warren was saying, is that, you know, most of the world shares this history of dehumanization through various forms of colonialism and apartheid, right? But how does someone pick it up and use it in a, you know, health setting? How do they use it in a, you know, someone like Magnificent, for instance, in creating movies? How do they think about issues of justice and equity? So we want to, you know, think about new ways, literally as we defined decolonization, as new ways of seeing and relating, and that goes for us beyond just the institutional or the formalized classroom setting.
Okay, thank you for that. If the audience has any questions, we'd like to hear them either in the chat. But I think in the meantime, I'll just make commentary on sort of how you phrased the sort of like this, you know, speaking to dehumanizing education in all aspects. And I think it's such a powerful way of thinking, you know, and even in corporate, the kind of teachings are quite relevant as well. As somebody who has some experience in the corporate space, I recall when I first got my internship, feeling a similar violence that I did being in, or rather silencing, being in university for the first couple of years. So I definitely think that what you, Kobani and Warren, speak to is sort of this need to educate even in spaces outside of schooling. I think that's such a powerful thing. I see that Magnificent has his camera and audio on. I think he might have something to say.
Oh, I didn't expect that you called me so fast. But I want to ask in terms of, but they already answered the first question. I wanted to ask about the vision and the mission and the goal of the book. What was in their mind when they wrote this book? What inspired them to go big and just not to narrow it down in the way like a lot of people when they narrow it down? What inspired them? So I feel like they've touched on the vision and the mission of the book, and Dr. Warren explained most of the goal of the book. But then my question now, okay, it's not a question basically, it's just something I would suggest. Would we see more collaboration between you two guys? Something like writing more on certain subjects or certain topics about power, knowledge, and those kind of things. Because that's what's lacking in society. People writing more about education, people writing more about informative stuff that will help a lot of people, and especially students like us, people that books that don't include more on lecturers, teachers, and whatsoever, but book that also incorporates the person who's receiving information and the person who's teaching. So it's not only about the sender, it's about the receiver as well. So are we going to see more collaborations?
Warren, are we gonna see more collaborations?
If you can deal with me for another 6 months, I would love it. I have a
wow.
Kobani, a quick confession. You know, Kobani told me I'm on sabbatical, I'm gonna relax, I'm gonna enjoy myself. I said, hey, Kobani, I have this idea. What do you think? Let alone Kobani didn't sleep for 6 months. He didn't have a relaxed time.
Yeah. So I think I'll start with Magnificent, and then Warren can take Ayanda's question. But for me, I have opened here. There's an so someone I mentioned her, Danai Mopotza, Dr. Danai Mopotza, has been a huge mentor for me for teaching and really bringing in conversations around love and so on in the classroom, because she's argued in her work that, you know, we often teach students to think, you know, critically, but often colonial education often means that we then make students find things that they hate in text, right? And I actually had written here to respond to earlier on to Magnificent, because there's a t-shirt I saw recently and I love it so much. And it says, joy and learning must coexist. It's like, but often a lot of the times we talk about critical education, rigorous education as always, in some form dehumanizing, right? So whenever a student has you have a good essay from a student, you always are taught to think critically, like how do you find something that's wrong, rather than really enjoying this beautiful essay that Magnificent said is written on structural functionalism and so on. So part of what I wanted for my side, and I'm sure Warren has also his own intentions with the project, was to not just focus on sort of all of these negative things, which are important, of course, around structural violence and white supremacy and so on in higher education. But also you'll see in the book that we actually spend quite a lot of time on learning as joyful. And we see from the student anecdotes. And I want to just read here from Danai, because we write that, she argues that colonial education is different, is deeply violent and often requires that students focus on what they hate in text. Mopwatsa calls for pedagogical conversations that focus on love and drive us to political freedom. She tasks teachers to consider the place of love in the classroom and loving students in ways that give them freedom. And she notes that this further requires we move away from conceptions of love as possessive and thus driven by lack, but rather that we think of love as giving freedom, not only to our students, but also to ourselves as teachers. And I really wanted genuinely that conversation to really exist, which is, of course, we really unpack all of these challenges that we face in education, but to also show the joy, right, of what it really means to be really, that it actually frees you and it gives you freedom, right, to be a loving educator, that to work towards unlearning, racist practices in your teaching styles and learning strategies and so on. So that was really my sort of intention around, I think if there was one thing that I want someone to take away with is the joy as well, not just of course the pains, but that how joyful it is to engage in anti-racist work and anti-racist teaching practices. So yeah, Warren?
I see there's some questions in the chat. I can't remember, Ayanda, forgive me. I'm multitasking to just sort of try and be as inclusive as I can. Ayanda, if you wouldn't mind repeating your question or going to the chat. I'm sorry, I have multiple devices just making sure I answer questions. So forgive me, I was a little bit distracted when you were talking. My apologies.
No problem. I think you'd actually touched on the question. So we'll just move to the chat. We have two questions. The first one is from Nikki, and it reads, do you have any tips for tackling racism that is entrenched within systems and structures, where those systems and structures do not see its own faults and moreover do not recognize your right to speak out? And then the second question is from Esihle, who asked that since seeing that we're living in a time that could be regarded as post-Fees Must Fall, or rather post-Fees Must Fall era in terms of the mass movement, what have we been getting wrong in regards to transformation in education in South Africa? So they're somewhat related.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just acknowledge Nikki, because one of the things about this workbook is that it is accessible to those who may have visual disabilities. And so you can, there's a link in there where you can click it and have audio descriptions. Nikki did such incredible work in terms of making this work accessible to our brothers and sisters and those who occupy various identities, to make it accessible to them. So I just want to acknowledge you for that, Nikki, and thank you for your great question. One of the key pieces, and I just want to unpack your question, is do you have any tips for tackling racism entrenched within systems and structures when those structures do not recognize your right to speak? I want to unpack this a little bit. The first question is your right to speak. And one of the things about this book is to understand that the process of subjugation begins by completely forcing the submission of your internal voice. That's almost one of the first steps of oppression, is this idea that you must sit and listen to the voices of who speaks and who listens and who makes decisions. So when you talk about your right to speak, okay, your right to have a voice, finding one's voice, and not even finding it, using it, is one of the critical forms of human liberation. Okay, and so when you talk about who recognizes your right to speak, that is a critical question of power. Okay, and I'd love to hear some reflections on that from our panelists around who needs to recognize my right to speak. I'm just asking that question. Okay, who needs to recognize my right to speak? I'm throwing that out as a question. But the second piece is, how do we recognize racism within our institutions and structures? So let's help define those two things very, very importantly. And I'm going to use a framework called internal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. Okay, and that's something you'll find in the book. Very simply, and this is very simplistic, just for this example, our internal thoughts influence our interpersonal interactions, so internal and interpersonal. But those interactions always occur within an institution, okay, formal or informal institution. And an institution is policies and procedures and resources, okay? Those institutions are embedded with oppression, embedded with bias, because people occupy those institutions, okay? And when those institutional rules overlap, we have a system such that a learner can experience oppression in the classroom, and then go to a police station and experience oppression in the police station, and then go to a hospital and experience oppression in their healthcare, and then go home and be told that we no longer accept you, experience oppression in the institution of the home. Those rules overlap, which is what we call systemic or system, all right, a system of racism or a system of oppression. Okay, so I just want to make sure that's clear. So how do you identify it? How do you understand it? One of the key things, one of the most critical things, is another thing we talk about in the book, which is LIPS, the language of the institution. When people talk about at-risk students, actually the system is not broken, it was designed. There is no such thing as a broken system. It is designed that way. So instead of talking about at-risk learners, we have to talk about a system that creates people at risk. So the first thing that's very important is to identify the language that we use and how it distributes power. The second thing we need to understand is the institutions. Most importantly, who makes decisions? Where are those decisions made? For those who have seen the play Hamilton, the room where it happens, where is the room? Who is at the table? Who is on the menu? And the table is a very problematic analogy to use, but I'm just trying to entrench this idea of who is making decisions. Okay, who is deciding whether your voice is valid or not? Okay, and let's unpack that critically. The third one is policies, really reflecting on the formal and informal policies that actually determine the resources in that space. People will tell you, well, we have an anti-discrimination policy. Well, we're inclusive. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force. Well, actually show me the results of this. Okay, and the final piece is the symbolism. Who is represented? Who is underrepresented? How are people represented? Okay, now in those spaces are the opportunities for resistance, the opportunities to change the language, the opportunities to critically reflect on who is making decisions and take action, the opportunity to create and subjugate oppressive policies and reform those policies. And to think about the symbolism and to think about the ways in which symbolism is so important. So Nikki, this is not just one strategy or one thing. This is reflecting on the 4 quadrants, reflecting on the different ways, and some of the work that we have to do, all of us have to do in different ways to make this happen. So I just want to kind of throw that out. Now the question, Kobani, I'm going to kind of be a moderator for a second and throw the second question, which is about voice. And I know that one of your chapters speaks about and I'm going to use the term that Bell hooks to, the murdering of the souls of Black students. I'd love for you to help us reflect a bit on that, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely. You actually would believe that I actually, in my notes, I was like, I need to make sure I talk about spirit murder. I think that's a really interesting question. And I wanted to say it at the beginning, SHL's question around, are we post-fees? Because the interesting thing about one of the critiques of fees must fall is that, particularly students at historically Black universities have been having fees must fall for at least 20 years before the white institutions or students at the white ones sort of started to have the numbers, right? So it's interesting. And actually at home, so my sister was the deputy SRC president at the former, it's now Walter Sisulu University, but at the time it was Eastern Cape Technikon. And I remember an article that we had framed at home of her literally being in the news. And it wasn't called NAFSAS back then, it was, I think, TEFSA or something like that, which is the National Financial Aid Scheme. So these conversations around sort of the fees must fall moment are in and of themselves very complicated, right? Because of this dynamic of, I think, as many people have critiqued that moment, which is it focused so much on historically white institutions and forgotten in some ways that, Black students at historically Black institutions have been for years talking about these issues of structural confusion. So on the one hand, it's this notion that we're even post fees must fall, for me, it doesn't exist. I saw something very interesting by a student who was saying, it's interesting that since 2015, most students have not had a quote unquote a normal academic year because, of course, of ongoing protests, the pandemic now, and various other challenges that they've faced. So I don't think, first of all, we are post fees must fall. I think fees must fall was itself very unresolved, right? I think students made some significant gains that, of course, can't be deflated in that moment, even within all the complexities of it. But I don't think even that moment was resolved. I think it's, again, I often go to Dr. Thabiseng Motseme, that she speaks of this notion of almost a spiritual repatriation, right, that never took place from the apartheid era. And I still think that the trauma, right, that's for one that students experience in that moment. Even now, just a few weeks ago, there was this article about, the young person who was sentenced to 5 years for protesting, for fees. So I don't think we are post fees must fall, and that's why I think it links to why issues of transformation haven't been addressed in universities. Because first of all, I think the issues, I think there is still, I think people know what has to happen. I don't think it's very complicated, but I think there is certainly an absence of will, and that will is linked to historically institutions of higher learning in South Africa not ever have been designed for Black people, right? We know this through Bantu education. Even apartheid itself was designed in a university, so it was always the maintenance of whiteness was always central to the education project. So I think it's very interesting because I currently work, and I hope I don't get myself into trouble, so I have to be very careful how I phrase this. But in a university that was merged, that was historically an Afrikaans university, right? But has since, I guess, merged with historically Black institutions and so on. And the most interesting thing for me is how, in some ways, I think the student body has, of course, changed. And now the student body is predominantly Black. But it's so interesting how, in terms of the higher structures, right, even though, of course, we have Black people in power and so on, in the institution, but it's very interesting how, when you look at the staff, that so much is untransformed, right? Even when you think about my own department, like there are only 2 Black South Africans, so South African anthropologists in a department of over 20 people. And I think that itself is telling. And there are multiple reasons that are tied, of course, to the history itself of anthropology and so on. So I think there are multiple reasons, and there are the structural ones, which is number one, as Rwanda was saying earlier on, which is often Black students have this issue of Black tax. So most can't stay beyond honors unless they have really good funding, which is very rare. Really good funding that allows them to have a life of optimal well-being. But generally, we lose, first of all, a lot of Black South African to those structural issues. And then the few who stay are often in such hostile issues around supervisors who perpetuate spirit murder, and various other forms that often make it very toxic, the environment for students to finish. And then there's also often, I've observed this as someone who's been bullied by my seniors at the university, not necessarily where I'm at, somewhere, because I don't want to get into trouble. But I've experienced that there's often a very little will to address issues of, particularly when people of color or Black staff members are reporting issues of workplace bullying, that is often not taken seriously. You're asked, literally, a senior had once asked me to basically suck up to the person who was abusing me at work. So there are so many structural interpersonal issues that I think make it very difficult for Black academics to stay. And when you stay, as Warren was talking about, then it can sometimes affect your mental health in very detrimental ways. So but I think the biggest one, because I can see we're out of time, but I think the biggest issue is the maintenance of whiteness, and how, even though we've managed to change the profile of students, but a lot of the people that we often have to work with, or the colleagues, are still of the apartheid era, and certainly the seniors would have been at these institutions when they were still predominantly white only. And so I don't think necessarily, unless you've had that spiritual repatriation that Dr. Motsebe talks about, which we haven't, but that I think we haven't really done that work of really, getting, I don't know, unlearn is not the word, because I don't think that's our job, but to really look at the sort of, that we haven't really changed the profile of staff members, and we have people who are really born and bred and marinated in racism, and I sometimes feel like they will, I'm not quite sure that there's anything we can do to change those kinds of minds, and that makes me sad. But I'm talking too much. Let me stop there.
I'm going to say that I have about 5 minutes, and then I have to go off. But we have one more question, Ayanda. And if it's okay with you, I might ask that we promote Louisa to a panelist so that she can ask a question, or he can ask his question in person. So please forgive me for making assumptions about your gender pronouns. But I just have promoted you. Kindly unmute yourself and let us know your question. And you are on mute.
Mute, yes. Okay, I live here in, I'm a union and equity union activist here in the UK, and we have been battling with issues of racism here. As I don't know if you've read the newspaper. Can you hear me? Am I muted? Yes. I last year, because somebody went on the BBC to say that there was no such thing as racism in the UK, members of the Race Equality Committee were resigned en masse, to shock horror. And that resignation exposed racism, actual racism within the entertainment industry in the UK. The other issue, the other good thing we had with, thanks to, with the issue of George Floyd, was a launch into tackling racism in this country. A report came out, which Warren, I will speak to you about when we meet, where we had a person appointed by the government to say that Britain wasn't institutionally racist. Shock horror, shock horror. The backlash to that report was welcomed by every trade union in this country. And the thing is that Silver was a Black man. And we have what annoys me most is our Black people who have reached the top refuse, just because they're already there, refuse to acknowledge and accept the racist behavior of every department up to the police. We've had people killed recently in police custody, Black people killed in police custody region, turning a blind eye to the practices that are going on here. So we've said enough is enough. And now we're wanting to introduce anti-teaching racist practices, teach young kids about the British Empire, the origins of Black people in this country, and that Black people didn't come to Britain as slaves. We were here long time ago, even before the Romans. And we even had Black generals in the Roman army and all that. So this is what we want to start teaching our children, that, look, because there's a lack of identity. You hear of Black kids killing Black kids. It's because you hear Black kids telling, say, an African, go back to the jungle where you came from. And you're looking at them and saying, so where do you think you came from? You know, so there's a loss. Young people don't have the identity that that has to be taught to them. And hence, you know, I'm passionate about this, you know, and they have to learn that, yes, they have to learn their sense of identity. They have to learn that they are human beings, that there is only one race, and that's the human race. And color should not be an issue in deciding who you are or where you come from. You know, and so that is my take on it. And thanks for inviting me to be one of this past panel, to be on the panel. And I hope we can do this again. And I hope, you know, because I would really like to share with you what we're doing here in the UK, so that, you know, in South Africa, they can understand what's been going on here as well. You know, everybody wants to come to the UK, but when they come, they're horrified at how institutionally racist this is. You know, it is an institutionally racist country, and we have a long way to go to tackle that, those practices. We don't have enough teachers. We don't have enough teachers who will teach African history, teach Black history in schools, and it's what we want to do. So yes, I'm going to buy your book.
Thank you so much. And I think I know.
Gobani, it is lovely to meet you. You know,
lovely to
you're
meet
a feminist like my grandfather was. I like feminist African men.
Thank you so much. I think your comment is really beautiful, and I think I understand we're out of time. So I think it's a really a wonderful intervention to really get us to the close. And just before we close, I wanted to just read something that I think really captures and responds to what you are saying, which is you write that it's important that there be a commitment to use education as an epistemic instrument toward of pervasive white supremacy in education through a blending of pedagogical practices that include anti-colonial, critical pedagogy, feminist pedagogy. In our teaching, we can bring in diverse perspectives. Through a rich blending of pedagogies, it becomes possible to critically interrogate prevailing assumptions and paradigms through a critical interrogation of biases in curricula, and at the same time providing opportunities to teach diverse students. And I don't think there's a better way to close.
Totally agree with you. Well, you've got my email anyway. I totally agree with you there. So yes, we have to teach the children.
Yes.
We've lost a whole generation of kids.
Absolutely.
So we have to start with the young ones now. We have to indoctrinate them. We are one human race. You know, and I always say to children, I always say to people, tell me what the color of all these flowers are. And when they start saying, I said, that's the human race you have just described. I use flowers as my identity. I said, that's the color of the human race. you know.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you. We know Warren has to go, so we have to sadly close, but hopefully we can continue somehow to have this conversation because they are so important, but not just have the conversations, but to find ways, strategic ways of moving forward, so that the next generation doesn't have to confront these issues that we're dealing.
I started joining Warren. Yeah, I started joining Warren last year. I attended all his webinars last year. So thank you, Warren. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ayanda. You were so fantastic. Couldn't have thought of a better moderator. Thank you, everyone, for spending. This is the most attended Gauteng Anthro event ever. So it's been so wonderful.
Congratulations.
Yay. Cheers.
Thank you.